Good evening. Hello, friends. I tried this earlier and I was just testing it, but apparently it is working. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little live stream. So I did not do a podcast this past week. I have been dealing with a couple of friends of my family that have both passed away within a week of each other. So that's not fun. But given that, I don't think that either of them would want me to stop doing what I'm doing for my own purposes. So I decided to just kind of come on tonight. I'm drinking a little bit of white wine, not my usual. Those of you that have been following me for a half a second know that my favorite thing is red wine, not white wine. But I thought I would come on this evening and talk a little bit about just some true horror stories that have happened to me in my own personal life. So I have no idea where I'm beginning with this. But that said, I grew up in a house in Lower Akron, which we jokingly always called LA, and Lower Akron, Ohio, where I grew up. I lived in a house that was over 100 years old. It was a nice little colonial in the Firestone Park area of Akron. And one of the things that I always noticed growing up in that house is it always just kind of had this aura about it where it felt like someone was watching you at all times. And you never really felt like you were by yourself, even when you were by yourself. So I thought I would come on tonight and talk a little bit about some true things that happened to me living in that house. One of my first memories living in that house was I recall sleeping in my older sister's bed, which, you are a little girl. I was 6. I think at the time my sister was 16. There's 10 years difference between us. She was a cheerleader. Back in the olden days of the 1980s when I grew up, uh, there were um, there was just this cool style. You always kind of looked up to your older sister, which I think most of us do. But excuse me. But I was very infatuated with like hanging out with my sister. That was my best friend in a weird way. And she did not treat me like a child. Most older siblings, they kind of like, oh, get away from me. Like, you're annoying. My sister did not do that. But one of the things that I remember is she was at school one day and I was homesick. I think it was either in when I was in kindergarten or it was an afternoon where I had got out of school, but I was napping and it was close to about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I was napping in my older sister's bed, as I liked to do because I just always wanted to be close to her at that time in my life. And I remember getting out of the bed and I noticed that there was a very tall man standing at the end of the hallway of our upstairs house. And this man was standing there and he kind of bent over and he was like looking at me like, hey, um, and I'm looking at him and I'm recalling in my mind's eye, this guy was like really, really tall, jet black hair. He had kind of like one of those, like, I don't know, like Grease kind of jackets on is the best way I could describe it. It's like the jackets from Grease. They weren't leather, but they were kind of like that real shiny, almost satin material. And he's bending over and he's trying to talk to me. And I could not hear a word that was coming out of his mouth. So me being the the 6-year-old that I was, hey mom, there's like a dude upstairs and he's trying to talk to me, but I can't hear what he's saying. And so at that moment, my mother like freaks out. She runs upstairs. She's like, what are you talking about? What do you mean there's a man up here? And so, my mom's looking around and I'm like, no, there was really a guy who was trying to talk to me. And my mother, the ever sweet human being that she is, but she didn't believe a word that was coming out of my mouth. She just assumed that I was tired. I had just woken up. I was probably dreaming. So that's basically how it was left. Later that week, I recall getting up out of my bed at like probably 2 or 3 in the morning. and looking out of my window that overlooked our backyard at the time. And there were these little housing complexes directly behind our house. And when I looked over at the housing complexes, they had these little alleyways that led to the big, large driveway, or I guess it was kind of like a parking lot for the three uh, duplexes that were behind my house. So the property line was pretty big, but um, there were like three alleyways. And so in the center alleyway, I could see a man standing there. And I woke up looking out the window, seeing this man standing there. And I noticed that he was looking up at my bedroom window. No, there was no lights on in my bedroom. And it was the same man that I had seen standing in the upstairs hallway several hours before. Um, I know it was not a actual person. I know that it was probably a spirit of some kind. I also lived probably, I would say, 1,000 feet from a cemetery, and it was a pretty large cemetery in Akron, where I grew up. It's like one of their biggest. So if you look up Akron, Ohio, there's several cemeteries that are fairly large, or at least really well known. The one that I grew up by was Holy Cross Cemetery, and it's a pretty big Catholic cemetery. And so I was like one street over from that cemetery. Um, I don't know if that had anything to do with the fact that I was, waking up to these weird things, but I did. Another one of my least favorite but most memorable things that happened to me was one Friday night back in the early 80s. I'm dating myself, people. I'm dating myself. There was usually Friday nights, my father left and he had a bowling like league that he joined back in the day. And when he was still alive, he went bowling periodically. He had a pretty big league in the early 80s at a place called Grand Lanes in I guess it was like towards East Akron on Arlington. It's no longer there. I think it's a CVS now. I don't remember. It's been a long time. Everything changes on that side of town. It that happens with cities that have been around as long as Akron. But so my father was at his bowling league. I'm hanging out with my mom. My brother was at his friend's house, which was probably about 4 houses up the street. And my sister was at a slumber party because she was always out of the house. She was never at home on a Friday if she could help it. There was cheerleading and then a football game. And then she was at her friend Leslie's house. So she's out. It was just me and my mom. And she's reading me a story. And my mom let me pick out the story that I wanted her to read to us. And my mom was kind of cool. She grew up with those giant, kind of like encyclopedia story books. There were probably like 50 giant volumes of storybooks. And so my mother, being my mother, she kept them forever. So one of the stories that I wanted her to read to me was The Little Mermaid, the original Hans Christian Andersen Little Mermaid. So my mom's like trying to read me this story. And she's reading the story and I'm like listening to her. And all of a sudden I hear this ha 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 ha, ha like out of the corner of like where she's like in our living room. When I grew up, there was a giant bookcase, and in the center of the bookcase, typical colonial, there was a fireplace in the center of it with two bookcases on either end of it. And so my mom's like sitting in this rocking chair that's next to the bookcase and she's reading me the story, and we kept hearing this like weird laughter and it's like ha 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 ha, and I'm like, "Mom, did you hear that?" I'm like 6 years old at the time. Like, "You didn't hear that?" And my mom's like, it's probably just something outside. So we're sitting there and she's reading me the story, and all of a sudden, about 5 minutes later, it starts up again. It's like ha 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 ha. And my mom stops, and I'm pretty sure she heard the same thing. She tries to this day tell me that she didn't hear anything. She's like, well, she hears the same thing, stops reading to me, and I look at her and I said, "Did you not hear that?" And she's listening to me and she's like, "Oh, it's probably something outside." And I said, "I don't know." And I'm feeling really creeped out by it. So she gets up and she says, "I'm going to look outside. It's probably nothing. It might be your brother and like one of his friends. I'm sure it's nothing." And I'm like petrified because I know um, I could tell that it was not something that was outside. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls in my house. It was very creepy. So she gets up and she goes outside and looks around, and we had these big bushes outside the house at the time. And it was kind of creepy. It's like one of those horror movies where you look outside, there's these giant bushes and you can't see around the bushes, but you just know there's some creepy guy standing out there watching you. So this was my mother, like looking out the door. She's like, I don't see anything, and like shuts the door. And it's kind of funny. So I'm like, "Oh, okay, mom. Okay." So she sits back down and she's trying to read me the story again. And I said, Hey, mom, um, are you sure you didn't hear that? She's like, Oh, no, no, it's fine. I'm going to finish reading the story. Then we give you a bath and it's going to be bedtime. And I'm like, okay. So to postpone bedtime, I'm like, let's go back to the beginning of the story and start over. Because I didn't want to take a bath. I didn't want to go to bed. It was a Friday night. I was in, I think, kindergarten or first grade at this point. So she says, okay, reading me The Little Mermaid. And so she's getting like halfway through the book. All of a sudden, I hear this like weird scratching coming out of the bookcase where we were sitting. At the time, we did not have pets. I think at that time my dog was probably a couple of years old, and he was not in the living room at the time. So it was not like there was no cat, there wasn't like any weird mice, there was nothing weird. So there's something scratching inside the walls next to the bookcase. So I tell my mother, Mom, did you hear that? And she just kind of ignores me and keeps reading the story. And so I'm listening to her and I'm trying to not pay attention to the weird scratching. And then all of a sudden, we both stop because there's more ha 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 ha, like this creepy, like kid laughter, like you would hear at a horror movie. And she looks at me and I looked at her and she goes, It's probably your brother. Now, granted, it's a Friday night in the fall in Ohio. It was dark outside, so at this point, it was probably about 7:30 in the evening, probably close to 8 o'clock. My brother at the time was like 12 years old. He wasn't outside. Like, it's just not. I mean, he did that sometimes. He would go out without telling my parents, as he tells me years later. But at that point in time, he wasn't outside. So my mom calls his friend's mother to find out if my brother was outside. And so she calls Mary, this lady, her name was Mary. She's like, Hey, is Robbie and Scott, are they still at the house? Did they leave? Are they there? And of course, Mary's like, Oh no, they've been here the whole night. They've been watching movies. No, they're here. So my mom says, Okay, fine. So that aside, um, my mother decides to hang up the phone and she says to me, I'm pretty sure your brother is not at his friend's house. I mean, he's at his friend's house. He's not here. He's not outside. He's totally at his friend's house. And I said, Okay, fine. But where did the laughter come from? And I'm dead serious. I'm like a child investigator at this point. I'm like, what the hell? Like, what is the sound? Um, so my mom decides to go next door and knock on our neighbor's door to find out if maybe it was the kid that lived next door. He was the same age as my brother. And so she's knocking on the door and she's like, Hey, and the neighbor's like, Hey, what's up? And she's like, Is your son in the house? We've been hearing this weird laughter outside. My daughter's kind of creeped out. Like, what is this? Like, what's going on? So the neighbor's like, No, he's been upstairs all night playing Atari. Because yes, once again, that's how old I am. The 80s were amazing. So she's talking to my mom, and my mom's like, Okay, fine, goes back home and sits back down. And at this point, my mom's kind of over reading me the story. She just wants me to get a bath and go to bed. So I'm sitting with my mom, and she says, You know what? You're going to go take a bath. I'm going to go upstairs and run the bath water and just come upstairs in like 5 minutes. And I'm like, Okay. And she wants me to put the books away, and so I'm putting the stuff away in the on the bookshelf, and I'm doing that before I go upstairs. And the house that I lived in, you could go upstairs, like in the front where the living room was, and then if you went up to the top of the staircase, you could go back down into the kitchen. So there was another staircase that led into the kitchen. So for whatever reason, I felt compelled to go into the kitchen where the back staircase was, and there was a window next to the kitchen steps, and then there was a window directly behind the kitchen steps which overlooked our kitchen sink. And I go to walk up the kitchen steps, and probably about 8 feet away was a breakfast nook that we had that wasn't in that same area, but it was opposite that area. And there was a window with those plastic blinds that you would pull down and they would just like yank right up really quickly. So that was the blind um, that we had. Like we had three of those in our house, like going up the stairs for whatever reason. They were weird. They're to this day, they're creepy to me. And so the blind, she pulled it, like she didn't touch it, but like you could pull it down and it would lift up. I'm walking through the kitchen to go upstairs, and three of the blinds that were in the kitchen that were just like that, all three of them simultaneously went up without being touched. So, of course, I run upstairs. I'm freaked out at this point. I'm like, what the hell? I'm 6 years old and I'm still like, what the hell? So I get up to the top of the stairs and I tell my mom, Mom, there's something going on. All the blinds just went up in the house. I think we have a ghost. And she's like, oh, come on. Like, stop it. Like, it's time for you to go in your room, get a bath. I'm not messing around with this anymore tonight. So she does that. And I go into my bedroom and my mom is standing behind me. And all of the dolls and stuffed animals that were on my bed that were always like mixed matched, excuse me, all the dolls that were mixed matched on my bed suddenly were sitting straight up, all facing the door to my bedroom. And at that same time, I heard that same laughter, that that creepy ass laughter. And my mom did not say anything at that point. That evening, I slept with my mother. I did not go into the bedroom until like the next day. I was not going in there. It was the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me in that house because there was just that whole thing with people, like the animals just looking at you. It was like, ah, yeah. So that was one of the paranormal things that happened to me growing up in my house. Um, One of the other things that happened to me as a kid growing up in the house was at the time of my senior year in high school, my friend Amanda and I were making midnight mochas, was just a thing that we did. My parents were upstairs asleep. And that same kitchen staircase, we just happened to be sitting on the staircase that went into the kitchen. We were making mochas, and she went upstairs to go to the restroom, and I'm sitting on the lower end of that staircase while I was boiling water, and we had a gas stove at the time. And 17 years old, like an idiot, left a towel lay next to the fire on the stove and didn't know it. And I'm sitting there like painting my toenails because I think we were painting our toenails and making mochas at the same time. I recall using toenail polish, like painting my toes. And all of a sudden, I felt somebody touch my face very hard and turn my head towards the stove. And I saw it on fire. And I ran over and grabbed the mitten and threw it in the sink, putting the fire out. And I distinctly remember the feeling of having someone touch me and like move my face to where the stove was to say, what the hell? Like, stop it. So some spirit, something made me move my head to stop that. So it was kind of a less scary thing that happened to me. But there were so many things that happened living in the house growing up. I mean, just so many things. I remember one of the first times I ever used my Ouija board was in that house, and I had some very interesting experiences with that. I'll have to do another live stream to talk about it, but I just figured, hey, it's Saturday. I'll get on, I'll tell a little story. So if you feel like it after this, feel free to comment in the comment section some of your own true creepy house stories. If any of you have grown up in a creepy house, let me know what you think about that because I was pretty creeped out most of my life growing up in that house. Yeah. But cheers. Happy Saturday. Tomorrow is Sunday. Thank God. But yeah, let me know what you think. And even if you don't believe in ghosts, did you ever have a creepy experience in your house growing up, or apartment or condo, or whatever you grew up in? Let me know. I would love to hear from you. Have a nice evening and good night.